So next thing I want to go over is kind of the whole what this webinar is really about, like the Flambient technique, right? Um, I want to talk about why we cover or why we get an ambient frame, like what we use it for, how to kind of shoot for it, and then I also want to talk about the reason we use flash and how to make the flash work for us instead of just making it, you know, making another step and another problem. Because if you're not using a flash right, you're just wasting your time, and it's really just like you're not doing anything to help yourself out. Like I've tried to edit other people's photos before, and I kind of see on the group like when they post, these two ambient frames and this flash frame made this frame or whatever, and I see flash frames sometimes that just have like it seems like the shooter doesn't know what they're doing exactly. So I want to try to clear some of that stuff up. Um, First thing we're going to talk about is ambient layers. Now, what I do is I bracket like most people. Um, but what we're going to use the ambient layers for is to record the natural light and the shadow play. So just kind of to keep that natural feel of the photo, we want to have the natural way that place looks, right? This has lights on. The lights were engineered into this house. I didn't have a choice to turn them off. And I mean, I think that actually in the end, it kind of did some help because there's some lighting in this house that's amazing looking. So I wanted lights on here. But I wanted to record how it felt naturally so we can kind of keep that vibe going. But we still need to control it and stuff later on. So the next thing that ambient layers do is it gives you a complete range of the exposures when you bracket. So if you can capture everything from the darkest to the brightest, you're going to have all the information you really need just in case something happens and you need to have something later. It's good to just get a nice range of everything. And then what we do with the natural light and shadow play is cover our tracks with the flash. So we try to hide the fact that we use flash, or because we don't want our stuff looking too flashy, right? We want it to look natural and we want it to look pretty, but we don't want anybody to know that we did anything. I want the viewer to lose themselves in the photo, not think about the work that went into creating the photo. You know what I mean? As photographers, I know we look at that all the time, but our viewers don't ever think about that stuff. They just want to look at it and say, wow, that's a pretty photo. I want to buy this house, So the way that we record them is this is my settings, at least this is how I do it. I auto expose or auto exposure bracket 1 to 2 stops. So I do 2 stops between each frame. And at the moment, I'm recording 5 flash frames. But you don't need that many. Sometimes like this one, I would only take 2 here. And I'm gonna get pretty much everything I need. With some manipulation, I can always bump exposures up or down to grab what I need out of these 2 frames. ISO for ambient layers, I usually keep it at 160, but if different settings for different cameras and everything else, I would say you can take it up to 640. And I think that's what Phil, you just record everything at 640, right? Like between ambient and flash.
Yeah, I don't ever see a noise issue with my Sony A7 III. I could probably go to 800 and not have a problem.
Right. So there's, like I said, depending on your camera and depending on the things that you do with the way you shoot, depends on how you work this. I use custom settings on my Canon, and I'm able to set up my ambient layers as C1 and my flash layers as C2 or whatever. So I set my C1 to be at ISO 160 just to, keep the noise levels as low as possible. But you can do whatever makes sense for you. But I would say just kind of, you don't want a lot of noise in these photos. So don't try to go too high in ISO. Aperture, I would say keep it between f8 and f11, but I mean, that also can depend on your sensor size, or if you're trying to do a detail photo, you want shallow depth of field. I personally shoot at f11 all the time because I want like absolute clarity from the front to the back of the shot. I want to see everything in focus, and that gives me that most of the time. And if you have a crop sensor or a micro four thirds sensor, you inherently have a longer depth of field, so you could probably go with f8 and give your flashes a break. Or if you maybe don't want to spend the money on an AD200, you could probably get the power you need out of, you know, a speed light if you're using like a f8 or maybe even f7.1 or whatever aperture for like a micro four thirds camera or something like that.
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider is the kind of flashes you have, because
Yeah,
you don't want to run them at, you know, full power the whole time, or you're going to burn through them, and it's going to recycle time's going to start getting longer and longer.
yeah.
It'll just
And then
increase your time on site.
I like to kind of be in the middle if I can. That way I do have wiggle room to go up or down if I need to, you know what I mean? So if I can manage to get my flashes in a majority of rooms, if I'm flashing at a quarter power or quarter to a half power, I still have room to go up and I have room to go down if I need to. And I like that, you know, just having a little bit of flexibility both ways. Your shutter speed here is going to be the variable. Like it's never going to be the same shutter speed all the time. So you're always going to change it. But that's how I basically, when I'm bracketing, I'm looking at my light meter and then I adjust my shutter speed until my light meter is in the place I want it to be at. Okay. Now you can set your brackets up to shoot however you know you see fit, but I shoot with my brightest one in the front, so I expose for that, and then it just all the way down and gets me everything I need to do or everything I need to make the photo. Let's move on to flash layers. So the purpose of a flash layer, and this is important, okay? The biggest purpose of a flash layer to me is to control highlights and bloom. Like if you look at the windows and these ambient layers here, you can see a lot of blooming and a lot of haziness around those windows. And you look at the flash, it's completely contained and perfectly controlled. And that's what we're going for. We're trying to get that dynamic range, and we're trying to basically just balance out the scene light-wise. So like I said, the next thing, expand the dynamic range. So, I mean, essentially a flash frame like this is an HDR photo also. It's a high dynamic range photo. You know what I mean? The dynamic range was achieved by the flash, but it's basically you're seeing inside to outside and you're dealing with a contrast all the while, and there's nothing that's really, you know, blown out or too dark to where you can't do something with it. So you also, another thing that flash does is it controls the color cast as long as you're flashing off something white or neutral. It also can create more depth and clarity. And like I said, it's there to balance the existing light. So you can also flash rooms that are off in the distance that maybe aren't as bright, and then bring them in later to kind of bring a nice even light throughout the entire scene. And we'll be showing you how to do that too. To capture my flash layers, my aperture does not change from the ambient layers. So I stay at f11. If you're at f8, stay at f8. Next thing is the shutter speed. The shutter speed I pretty much set to my sync speed, which is I think it's 1/60th of a second on my camera. And that's because I'm trying to, you know, bring the windows down or the interior lighting down, control them. The shutter speed will control that. Basically trying to control my exposure. So, and then but it's also variable too, because you can go down, but you don't want to go past your sync speed. But you can always go down if you need to let more light in. Say if it's dark outside or something like that, then you can open up your shutter speed and let more light in and just try to balance it out though. ISO for flash layers, I leave it at 640. But this is also a variable, like what I was talking about with the flash. Like I want to be in the middle so I can go up or down. 640 is that for the ISO. If I need to bring the exposure down to, like, if the windows are still too bright, I can go down to ISO 320 or 160 or even 100 if I need to. And I can also go up if I have to, because my camera could probably get up to 1250 and still be fine. Especially with Lightroom, it does a great job in handling noise. And once you do the blend and you add your sharpening back, like a lot of that stuff, you're good to go. But let's see. So this is what you get out of a blended image, basically. So we get the flash layer and the ambient layer together, and we make something like this. Kind of a balance between the both, and that's the whole reason for doing Flambient in the first place. Phil, any questions on that whole thing, or?
Nope.
Okay, cool.